A court can invalidate a map. It cannot erase a runway. It cannot remove a Coast Guard ship from a shoal. It cannot stop a patrol from returning tomorrow morning. That is the problem in the South China Sea. Law became clearer. Control kept being practiced. And that is why this sea matters. Not only because cargo crosses it, not only because energy flows through it, but because it has become one of the clearest examples of a place that looks commercially open while slowly behaving like a militarized grid. The South China Sea is not just a highway for cargo, it is a system for shaping behavior. At first glance, the South China Sea looks like a shipping story. Container vessels move through it, energy cargoes move through it, fishing fleets move through it. On the surface, it looks like circulation, a commercial sea doing commercial work. But the same basin also carries Coast Guard pressure, surveillance coverage, reef fortification, alliance signaling, and legal confrontation. That is the contradiction. One body of water affects cargo prices, naval planning, food security, and maritime law at the same time. That only happens when several systems overlap in one compact space. Trade is one layer, military reach is another, fisheries decline is another, law is another. And when all of those layers collide, even small incidents begin to matter far more than they look. A blocked resupply mission is not just a local dispute. A water cannon strike is not just a dramatic image. A near collision between Coast Guard ships is not just a maritime argument. Each incident becomes a test of resolve, a test of routine, a test of what can slowly become normal on the water. That is the deeper contest here. Not only who sails through the sea, but who gets to shape the behavior of everyone else inside it. A fifth of global trade still uses this contested sea because the alternatives are simply worse. That is what makes the South China Sea so important. Even with tension, confrontation, and military pressure, ships still keep coming because rerouting costs more time, more fuel, and more money. The sea stays busy not because it is stable, but because the alternatives are too expensive. That means risk does not make the sea irrelevant. It makes it more strategic. So before looking at reefs, missiles, or court rulings, start with the simplest truth. This sea remains commercially essential, and that is exactly why strategic competition inside it matters so much. The South China Sea is one of the most important commercial arteries in the world. Around a fifth of global trade still passes through it. That number is large enough on its own. But the real issue is not only how much trade moves across the water, it is what else shares the same space. Because the shipping lane is only the visible layer. Above the surface are merchant ships and fishing boats. Below and around them sit sonar coverage, submarine routes, air patrols, radar networks, missile reach, and surveillance systems. The same water can function as a trade route in one moment and as a latent engagement zone in the next. The South China Sea does not just move cargo. It moves radar beams, missile coverage, and alliance decisions. That is the hidden layer most maps do not show. A sea lane is easy to understand. A sea lane wrapped inside a surveillance grid is something else. The same corridor that carries containers and crude also carries strategic risk. Trade is the visible surface. Control is the deeper system. This is why the South China Sea cannot be treated as only an economic issue. A normal shipping map shows movement. A strategic map shows vulnerability. The difference matters because a sea can remain open and still become more coercive. Shipping does not need to stop for control to increase. Insurers can reprice risk. Fishermen can avoid certain grounds. Energy companies can delay exploration. Smaller states can alter their patrol behavior. Navies can spend more time watching and shadowing. That is how leverage works in a basin like this. Not necessarily through total closure, through controlled normality. The water remains commercially active, but behavior inside it becomes more conditioned by pressure. Above the surface are cargo ships and fishing boats. Below them sits a latent kill zone of submarines, sensors, and missile arcs. That is what makes this sea deceptive. From a distance, it looks like commerce. In strategic terms, it behaves like layered infrastructure for detection, reach, and coercion. A commercial corridor and a military environment can occupy the same water at the same time. That overlap is the story. And once that is understood, the next question becomes harder. How did open water become so structured in the first place? The answer begins with reefs. Some of the most important positions in the South China Sea began as marginal features. Reefs, shoals, low-lying outcrops, places that once looked too small to matter. Then they were transformed. Dredging, land reclamation, concrete, runways, harbors, radars, storage, hardened shelters. What once looked like geography became infrastructure, and infrastructure changes distance, endurance, and reach. Some of the most important military positions in Asia began as reefs that barely broke the surface. That is the scale of the transformation. A feature that once looked irrelevant can become an airstrip, a radar site, a logistics stop, or a missile support node. Geography did not just get occupied, it got engineered, and engineered geography changes everything around it. This matters because borders on paper did not visibly change in the way most people imagine, but the operating geometry of the sea did. A reef turned into a runway changes aircraft persistence. A fortified outpost changes surveillance range. A harbor changes the tempo of patrols. A support node changes how long pressure can be sustained. That is why artificial islands matter more than they first appear. They are not just political theater, they are operating nodes, and once one side demonstrates that features can be turned into durable infrastructure, others begin adapting. This is where the story becomes more complex. China is the central actor in the island building story, but it is not the only state adjusting geography. Vietnam has also expanded and fortified features under its control. Not at the same scale, not with the same strategic weight, but enough to reveal something important. Once geography becomes weaponized, others start copying the model. China is not the only state turning features into infrastructure. Vietnam is quietly expanding and fortifying its own positions too. That matters because it shows how strategic competition spreads by imitation. Once one actor proves that reclamation and fortification change leverage, other claimants adapt. The sea becomes harder to demilitarize because the logic of infrastructure starts reproducing itself. The map begins to harden, so the transformation of reefs is not a side story. It is one of the reasons the basin now behaves less like open water and more like a distributed system of forward positions. Most people imagine maritime conflict as grey warships, missile launches, and clear military escalation. If you value calm, in-depth explanations like this, subscribe to Beneath Systems for more videos that uncover the systems shaping our world. The South China Sea usually works differently. Its most important pressure is often applied below that threshold. This is the world of grey zone coercion, blocking, shadowing, ramming, water cannons, escort pressure, maritime militia activity, persistent Coast Guard presence. All of it serious, all of it calibrated. The goal is not necessarily to start a war. The goal is to change facts on the water without crossing the formal line into full-scale war. In the South China Sea, some of the most important strategic moves are made by ships painted like law enforcement, not warships. That is what makes this contest so effective and so difficult to answer. A Coast Guard hull looks less escalatory than a Navy destroyer. A militia vessel looks less threatening than a missile frigate. But in practice, these platforms can still block, harass, escort, and reshape behavior. Civilian branding, strategic effect. This method matters because it creates ambiguity. A missile strike forces a response. A water cannon attack creates arguments. A Navy battle is obvious. A collision between Coast Guard vessels raises harder questions. How serious was it? Who initiated it? Does it trigger alliance obligations? How much risk should insurers now price into the corridor? How should patrol patterns change? Tiny collisions between Coast Guard ships matter because they test red lines, alliance responses, and insurance risk without starting a formal war. That is their strategic value. They are small enough to stay below the threshold of open conflict, but serious enough to reveal what governments will tolerate. A minor incident can send signals to navies, insurers, diplomats, and domestic audiences all at once. That is why these clashes are watched so closely. This is why the South China Sea feels unstable, even when no major battle has begun. Pressure is continuous. It is daily. It is cumulative. And because it is repeated so often, it slowly tries to redefine what becomes acceptable, not by treaty, by routine. The legal conflict in the South China Sea matters because it defines legitimacy. UNCLOS offers one rule set, exclusive economic zones, maritime entitlements, and a legal logic based based on modern law of the sea. Historic rights claims offer another kind of argument, and the gap between those frameworks is where much of the struggle happens. The 2016 arbitration ruling mattered because it clarified the legal baseline. It weakened the legal basis of the 9-dash line. It challenged broad claims that could not be sustained under the law of the sea, but it did not remove a single patrol. It did not dismantle an outpost. It did not reverse land reclamation. It did not clear the water by itself. The 2016 ruling clarified the law, but it did not move a single ship or dismantle a single runway. That is the brutal gap between legal clarity and physical control. Courts can define rights. They cannot enforce them alone at sea. So the ruling changed the argument, but not the immediate balance of presence. Law matters, presence matters too. In the South China Sea, those two do not automatically align. This is one of the central truths of the basin. Legal legitimacy and operational control are not the same thing. A state can win an argument in law and still face pressure in practice. A state can lose legal ground and still retain physical leverage through ships, infrastructure, and repetition. That is why the South China Sea remains unresolved in practical terms even after major legal clarification. And it is why smaller claimants often rely on three tools they can still use: law, public exposure, and partnerships. Not because those tools solve the problem immediately, but because ship-for-ship symmetry is often impossible. So the struggle continues in the space between what is legal and what is enforced. By this point, the South China Sea no longer looks like a narrow dispute over reefs. It looks like a test of regional order, because what happens here affects more than the claimants. It affects alliance credibility, energy security, naval doctrine, insurance behavior, food security, and the practical meaning of maritime openness in Asia. Start with fisheries. This is not a side issue. This basin supports livelihoods for millions of people, yet parts of it are under severe ecological strain. Overfishing, destructive practices, and long-term depletion have reduced what remains available. That creates pressure on coastal communities. It creates pressure on governments, and it feeds competition over access to what is left. This is not only a military contest, it is also a collapsing fishery that millions of people still depend on. That matters because ecological decline changes politics. When catches fall, pressure rises, livelihoods tighten. Governments face domestic strain, and disputed waters become even more sensitive because fewer resources remain to compete over. Fisheries collapse belongs in the same story as missile ranges because both shape state behavior. This is why fisheries decline belongs in the same story as Coast Guard pressure and missile coverage. Ecology is not separate from strategy here, it feeds it. Then there is the outside power dimension. Navies from beyond the immediate claimants keep showing up for a reason, not only to escort trade, not only to signal presence, but because if daily operational space is left uncontested, the rules of the basin can start shifting by default. The real struggle in the South China Sea is not just over who sails through, it is over who gets to define what normal behavior looks like there. That is the deepest layer of the contest. If one pattern of pressure becomes routine, it slowly becomes expectation. If expectation hardens, then a new operating order emerges without formal closure and without formal annexation. Control begins to look normal. That is why the whole Indo-Pacific watches this sea so closely, because this is not just a local maritime dispute, it is a test case. Can a commercially open sea become gradually more coercive without ever fully closing? Can infrastructure, patrols, and grey zone pressure rewrite conduct faster than law can restrain it? Can alliance commitments remain credible under constant low-level pressure? Can maritime order survive when the contest is not over borders alone, but over daily behavior? The South China Sea matters because all of those questions now live in one basin, and the answer will shape more than shipping routes. It will shape how power, law, and access interact across Asia. The real question is not whether ships can still pass through this sea. They can. The real question is who gets to decide the conditions under which everyone else must pass. That is the struggle, not only over territory, not only over law, not only over trade, but over normal. And that is why the South China Sea is not just a highway for cargo, it is a system for shaping behavior. If this video gave you a clearer way to understand the world beneath the surface, subscribe to Beneath Systems for more deep dives every week.